Both you and I have been doing this for a long time, and it'd be good to just get your reflection on what's changed, with the plan assessment process over the 30 plus years that you've been doing this.
You keep mentioning that number, Scott, and you're making me feel
Is it
old. But
40?
long enough that when I first started doing this, we didn't even have email. We were doing the classic print out a PowerPoint deck. Well, we didn't have PowerPoint back then.
I feel young. Hi, I'm Scott Barton, and this is What I Wish I Knew About Incentive Compensation Best Practices. And today we're talking about the practice of incentive plan assessment. Now, most of us accept that doing an assessment of the incentive plan, and particularly the sales compensation program, is a good practice. But what specifically are good practices, and what are the things that get in the way of good practice? Well, our guest today certainly can answer those questions. He's Mark Davis, an associate partner at Aon Consulting. He's in the firm's Salesforce effectiveness practice, and for more than 30 years has been working with sales compensation plan design and management. Mark, it's good to see you again.
Thanks, Scott. Good to see you as well.
Now, Mark, let's talk first about timing. What time of year do you tend to see the most requests from clients for doing a plan assessment project?
We tend to see the most requests probably in the 2 to 3 month time frame prior to the new plan year taking effect, whether that's on the calendar year or a fiscal year start, whatever it happens to be. Too often we see too little time afforded. Ideally, we would much prefer getting those calls at least 6, if not even 9 months in advance of the new plan year starting, to give us ample time to work through the assessment, assuming new plan design changes are anticipated as a result.
And why is it that companies don't start sooner, or they don't use an ongoing process for keeping abreast on how effective their plans are?
Well, I think the answer to those two questions are related. I think more often than not, there is not an effective, kind of regimented, ongoing assessment process that is put into effect at the beginning of the plan year and is run consistently throughout the year, let's say at least on a quarterly basis. I think a lot of that has to do with just, in most of our clients' cases, a lack of internal bandwidth to dedicate the resources to that kind of thing, which also then tends to result in teeing up the whole question of, gee, we need to take a look at the plan. Do we need to make changes for next year? Those questions usually just get asked too late in the year, and it really compresses the time that they can make available to really do a thorough job assessing the effectiveness of the current plan.
Yeah. Well, so, mea culpa, I say I'm with a company that hasn't been doing the things that, we know need to be done, but it's time to get started. So what are some things that I can do as a project manager on assessment to help ensure a quick start, that, we get on track quickly?
Well, one of the things that most often hangs us up from a timing standpoint in terms of really being able to run forward meaningfully in an assessment is just getting access to data. And what I mean by that is, when we're facilitating a sales incentive plan assessment project, we'll provide a data collection template that asks principally for three things. One is incumbent or employee level demographic information, employee ID, name if they're able to provide it, where they're located, reporting relationship, that start date, term date kind of stuff, right? All the demographics. But then we're also asking for pay data, and we're asking for performance data. Well, the pay data is often housed in a different internal system, accessed or owned by human resources, for example, whereas the performance data is usually in a different system, often owned by sales or sales ops. And so we're asking the client to pull together a consolidated data set of historical pay and performance data, and they're usually having to pull it from disparate sources internally. If that is already being done, and the plan kind of assessment that we would perform is already being done, let's say quarterly, that hurdle's cleared. Too often than not, those kinds of analyses are not being performed, and it's quite a chore to pull that kind of data set together.
Yeah. So in the times where you've completed, just a really good assessment, what are the things that you look to, that you point at, that are evidence of a really good assessment outcome?
Great question. I would say it extends well beyond what we were just talking about in terms of having a solid data set that has at least 1 year, if not two or more years of pay and performance data. It gets beyond the quantitative analyses into more qualitative considerations too. Usually, beyond that kind of pay for performance data analysis, we're connecting with key executive stakeholders to help inform what are the go-to-market priorities, what are our expectations of the sales force, how do we measure success, and get some internal perceptions of how the current plan is working or not from a variety of executive stakeholders. And this is certainly out just not just the sales leadership. This should be HR, this should be finance, this should be sales ops, depending on the type of organization, maybe ops and marketing. But who are the various executive stakeholders that really have a lot of value to add in terms of painting a picture of how do we measure success? What are the key metrics that we need to be marching toward as an organization? And how do we translate those go-to-market imperatives through a sales incentive plan? Beyond the executive stakeholders, quite often we'll do interviews with sales management and individual contributor salespeople, right? They'll provide a much different perspective. Those conversations are less about painting the strategic vision, and they're more about understanding how the rubber meets the road in terms of uh, uh, whether sales roles are clearly understood, whether the execution of the sales process is what management or sales leadership thinks it is. How are they allocating their sales time between things like new account acquisition activities versus existing account management activities? And very importantly, getting their perception of the current plan. Do they even understand it? Right? Can they, in a nutshell, at a high level, summarize how the current plan works? Quite often, we'll ask, "So tell me, describe your current plan to me." And by the way, when we ask that question, we know exactly how it works because we've reviewed the plan documents. But too often, a sales rep won't even be able to describe how the plan works because they don't understand it. That's pretty telling, right? So we do that kind of interviewing executives, field sales participants, but we're also, like I mentioned, we're reviewing plan documentation so that we can make observations relative to best practice insights about how the current plan is constructed. So there are a lot of different inputs that go into that assessment. And the one thing I haven't even mentioned yet is competitive benchmarking, right? Where we're taking a look at a minimum, do current pay levels align well to market norms, right? And so again, a lot of different pieces of that assessment puzzle that really should be considered.
Yeah. Let's talk more about that qualitative input, and in particular from the salespeople. Now, I came across some research recently from Sales Management Association where they said that firms that incorporate rep input are far more likely, when that input is used for the plan change decisions, are far more likely to observe effective sales compensation plans. But yet, there's still companies and leaders that resist having their reps, not their managers, but their reps participate in the assessment process. So, how do you convince those people that this is an important piece of input?
Great question. And I would say, on the whole, in all of my years of doing this, maybe only 50%, maybe even only 40% of the time, do we get access to individual contributor salespeople. The biggest concern is we don't want them to take their eye off the ball. Maybe we're in or approaching fourth quarter, and it's really important for us to close the year. We don't want them distracted with this. That's one key argument. Another one is, we don't want this to become a gripe session. We don't want to open Pandora's box and take in all this negative press, or hear all this negativity, right? That we're expected to do something about. In our uh, experience, really, when we get sales reps to weigh in, when we give them an opportunity, right? And this is the way I typically couch the conversation to a sales leader. Look, in a 60-minute, these are typically 60-minute one-on-one interviews with a sales rep. We're spending the first 45 to 50 minutes talking about the nature of the sales process, how they execute it, the nature of their role, how much of their time are they spending in this type of selling activity versus that type of selling activity. It's really about sales process, job content and role clarity. And then toward the end, maybe the last 10 or 15 minutes, that's when we talk about pay. So we're doing a lot more to understand the extent to which they clearly understand their role. They have the tools and means by which they can effectively execute it. Then we're talking about compensation, right? So it's not just a gripe session. And we do that, by the way, so that we really understand what are the things that they can control that should be potentially measures of performance in the plan. What are the things they can't control, right? That shouldn't be part of the sales incentive plan. Getting their perception, though, on strengths and weaknesses of the plan does allow us downstream, presuming we go beyond assessment to redesign, when that new plan is launched. This is fodder for the new plan messaging, right? Because now sales leadership can say, you'll remember that a select number of our sales team had the opportunity to participate in interviews on the front end. Here's a summary, high-level summary of what we heard from you, and some bulleted um, um, summarization of the key points they made. Here's how we translated your input into some of the new plan features that we think you're going to be very excited about. So it's about getting early buy-in to downstream plan changes. When they feel like they've had a voice in the overall design process, likely they're not sitting around the design team table, right, with sales leadership and HR and sales ops and so forth. But when they've had a voice vis-a-vis those one-on-one interviews, they feel like they've been heard. And you can really get some mileage or leverage out of that when you're announcing the new plan.
It makes sense. What one of the areas that I've always really enjoyed about plan assessment is the interviews, the personal contact, and with sales leaders in particular, because these are typically big personalities, and it's entertaining. Now it can go sideways sometimes, and I remember years ago this was with Nestle, and I'm on site doing executive interviews. Picture this windowless room, right? It just had finished one. A guy comes in, a sales leader. He doesn't introduce himself. He doesn't sit down. He says, "Look, I think this is a waste of time, and I don't agree with this assessment. I'm not participating in it, and you should pack up your things and go back to where you came from." So in those types of situations, and I'm sure you've encountered a few of them, where you've got someone of influence who does not want to participate in the process. How do you work through that?
Well, yeah, occasionally we'll get that from a senior sales stakeholder early on. And there's usually, for whatever reason, whether it's pride of authorship because they designed the plan and they don't want it changed, or they think it's working for them or their constituents, right? So they're resisting it. And by the way, quite often the impetus for change is not necessarily sales leadership. It's the CFO, for example, who's observing maybe our top line continues to grow incrementally, but our margins are suffering, right? Or maybe we're being successful in spite of ourselves because we continue to sell the legacy product or service, and our sales team is completely ignoring the new stuff that we're rolling out, right? Whatever the issue is, quite often it's someone other than sales leadership who's calling for the change. But the process, in order for it to be successful, has to get sales leadership on board, right? And so it's usually that the framing of that conversation typically happens well before the executive interviews begin. This is in scoping and the project to begin with, defining who's on our collective design team, agreeing on what are the presenting issues that we're trying to solve for, and usually this the sales leadership team, or maybe it's just the chief sales officer or the head of sales, is an active part of that discussion at the outset. And it's usually quite a process to frame the project effectively, define the scope of work and the project work plan so as to meet those presenting issues, and using that process to get them on board. Um, in the case of your client example, the only time I've run into anything similar to that is when it's a fairly senior level, let's say field sales manager, let's say it's a regional director who was not involved in the framing of the project, who's just being brought along. Well, to me, that's a conversation that the overall head of sales needs to be having with their team. And typically, before we launch into those interviews, we really insist that an active communication go out to the team to say, first of all, we're doing this project. Here's what we're looking at. Here's what we're trying to solve for. We've partnered with Mark as part of the Aon team, blah, 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 blah. Here are the objectives. He's going to be reaching out to a number of you for input. Here's what we'd like to hear from you. Please be candid, right? So there's some, the setting of the stage for these conversations to be effective in the first place, just so we don't walk into a room cold. The participant really doesn't understand, why am I here? What are we doing? Who are you? Right? So there's some legwork in advance that will hopefully get us out of those awkward conversations.
We both you and I have been doing this for a long time, and it'd be good to just get your reflection on what's changed, with the plan assessment process or the tools used over the 30 plus years that you've been doing this.
You keep mentioning that number, Scott, and you're making me feel
Is it
old, but
40?
it's 32 to be precise.
I feel young.
Long enough that when I first started doing this, we didn't even have email. We were doing the classic print out a PowerPoint deck. Well, we didn't have PowerPoint back then, but print out a deck, bind it, fly to the client, and present the hard copy. But be that as it may, I would say one of the things that's changed is, I would say, certainly the advent of the sales operations function. What exists today in most organizations did not exist 32 years ago when I started this business. Okay. And what I mean by that is, now companies are more likely to have dedicated resources to focus on the topic of Salesforce effectiveness. Part of that most certainly is the sales incentive plan aligning and meeting our business needs, right? So, given that we have dedicated resources to within most client organizations that are specific to the sales ops function, I would say it's gotten a little bit easier, because it's like the example that I shared about the disparate data sources to pull together that employee census data file, some coming from an HR payroll system, some coming from another finance or sales ops system. Well, at least you've got a point person who understands that, who's helping to pull it together. And in a lot of more mature, sophisticated organizations, these are people who are doing some level of ongoing analyses of the plans today that more often than not did not exist decades ago, right? So that's I would say one of the biggest differences is sales operations internally being the advocate for sales incentive plan governance and change.
Mark, the spirit of this series is all about personal learning and growth. And I ask this question to all of our guests: what do you wish you knew more about?
That's a really long list, Scott, but I'll keep it specific to
The
the
first thing
sales
that comes
comp
to mind.
world. Yeah, sales comp. So here's something I wish I learned or knew more about, and that is the use of equity compensation, long term incentives for sales organizations. In a lot of industries, it's really a non issue,
Mm,
right? But in certain industries, for example, life sciences, and I spend a lot of my consulting time in the life sciences sector, it's a big issue, particularly in the biopharma space, not so much med device, but in biopharma. Fortunately, I've got a lot of colleagues who are really deep in the whole equity compensation thing that I can leverage and rely on. But I personally wish I knew more about, why do companies typically start when they're in an emerging commercial situation? They start with options and then they over time migrate to RSUs, right? Why do companies discount their equity guidelines for the sales population versus the non-sales population? Just things like that that I think would make me more effective as a consultant.
yeah, well, there's always more to know. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for being our guest today. I want to thank the audience as well, and encourage those to subscribe that haven't already. And please give us your comments. We'll talk soon.